Hello, our dear viewers, everyone in the audience. A special greeting to those who are watching us online. Good evening, Alexander Ivanovich.
Good evening.
It's been almost a month and a half since we first raised the question here about the Americans' moon landing, or what they claimed to be a moon landing. The time has come to continue our discussion. We have some unfinished business from the last show, as the first episode's announcement mentioned issues related to the technical aspect, specifically the Saturn V rocket. Will we be discussing that today, or is it still too early?
Since there is indeed such interest, and probably we are all ready, there is a public need for a thorough conversation. Not in a rush. Meeting, discussing, presenting arguments and counter-arguments, and moving on. There have already been dozens, hundreds of such meetings, with little to no result. I think many conditions are necessary for a successful space mission. This includes a soft landing, a mission control center, and so on. But the main conditions for the flight are the presence of the spacecraft and the rocket. Without them, it is impossible. One can say that a flight to anywhere, for example, Earth's orbit, starts with the rocket, or one can say it starts with the spacecraft. Simply for convenience, the issue with the spacecraft is more developed, it's easier to understand, and doesn't require special knowledge, just good school competence. I might talk later about knowledge acquired at school. Therefore, now we are considering the spacecraft. Essentially, we had two topics. The first is the color of the moon, and the second is that people do not return from space in good physical shape. Somehow, these topics cast doubt on the Apollo spacecraft. There is a good saying, third time is the charm. There might be one random circumstance against Apollo. It needs to be defended. Today I want to discuss the third topic. According to my plan, it is the last one. There might be a special super topic, which is Apollo's visit to the city of Murmansk. In 1970, a captured Apollo stood on the quay in Murmansk. I will talk about this and we will show it. But now let's focus on the spacecraft. We'll deal with the rocket next time, I think. How exactly? Very often, people say, Comrade Alexander Popov, you're not a specialist in the rocket and space field. Why are you sticking your nose into this business? On this matter, I really liked an aphorism by Leonid Konovalov. They were discussing a photograph allegedly taken on the moon. As a cinematographer, Konovalov perfectly understands how to shoot something and what techniques to use. They told him, "You're not a rocket scientist. Why don't you mind your own business?" His response was, "You know, when we discuss a rocket engine cutaway, then special knowledge in the rocketry will be required. But right now, my knowledge as a cinematographer is more relevant." I would like to add this. The moon hoax, and I am inclined towards this viewpoint, does not require deep knowledge in the rocket engineering. It requires deep knowledge in the art of delivering information and disinformation. That's where the success of the moon hoax lies. It was a masterful disinformation campaign by the Americans. Naturally, we find many errors today, but how many years have passed? Initially, it was just superb. I wanted to say a few more words about schooling, as it again pertains to the concept of, you're not a specialist. I worked with college students for about 25 years. When perestroika came, it was a difficult time when science stopped being funded. I became a school teacher. I taught physics in school for 10 years. Initially, I thought, I know physics, I'll come and explain everything to the students in high school. But then I realized that teaching students in high school is harder than teaching college students. University undergraduates are motivated, which is the first thing. Secondly, I became convinced that it is the high school that shapes a person. Character, indifference to knowledge, or, on the contrary, enthusiasm for knowledge. Much of this is instilled by the school. Later, the person will develop, but on the foundation laid by the school. A university makes a specialist and provides a narrow profession. For example, I am a specialist in laser physics and laser technology. I like the aphorism about specialists. Every expert is like a gumboil. His fullness is one-sided. Sure, a specialist knows his subject very deeply. For instance, the design of a rocket engine. But beyond that, no. So, the moon hoax is a matter of information and disinformation. How is it verified? By common sense. Don't be shy. I remember the Gorbachev years, when the Soviet Union was not yet destroyed, but its structure was already trembling. I kept thinking, what is Gorbachev doing? Maybe we just don't understand everything. After all, we are simple people. But later, it turned out that I understood everything correctly, and we all did. He was simply betraying the country. What do I want to say with this? Let's not be afraid of our own minds and our own logic. And now, allow me to move on to the topic. It is sort of 40 years behind the Apollo program. Apollo ended, and for 40 years, the Americans had reusable space shuttles flying into space. It would seem they are completely different programs. What is the connection between Apollo and space shuttles? Indeed, there is no direct technical connection. But what happened after the shuttles were discontinued unexpectedly showed that besides the shuttles, the Americans had nothing else noteworthy. Therefore, I begin my story with the shuttles. After this, we will return to the Apollo and draw certain conclusions. So, the topic is called NASA Hitchhikes into Space. The term hitchhiking was coined by the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, so this is not our invention. This space hitchhiking lasted 9 years, from 2011 to 2020. What does the moon have to do with it? I tried to somehow highlight the connection. We will return to this in due course. So, 20 years after Gagarin's flight, on the exact day Gagarin flew, April 12, 1981, the first American reusable space shuttle was launched. Here, the space shuttle is shown. And next to it, below, is an image of the Soyuz in roughly the same scale. Look, it's a tiny thing, just a dwarf. True. The shuttle has a central part with open doors. This is a large cargo bay. But its passenger cabin is also far from small. In general, all this created the impression of the complete space superiority of the United States. And if we also consider that psychologically, we had already suffered a heavy defeat, as we kind of lost the moon race, another victory of the United States completely overwhelmed our consciousness. This is the International Space Station, which will often appear in our story. A space shuttle is an extremely expensive machine. One trip cost $1.5 billion to bring astronauts to orbit. This is quite expensive even for America. In total, 4 shuttles were built. Columbia, which we will see, Atlantis, Discovery, and Challenger. This fleet of 4 shuttles was supposed to solve all problems with transporting astronauts back and forth. All 4 shuttles made 135 trips to orbit over 30 years. They were in operation from 1981 to 2011. But generally speaking, in any product, including a spacecraft, the main thing is not its size or even the number of missions, but how effectively it accomplishes its assigned tasks. In this regard, the shuttles turned out to be somewhat lacking. This has become clear now, although at the time we were all enchanted by the space shuttles. The beginning of the Space Shuttle program was very impressive. I would say that the period from 1981 to 1986 was particularly remarkable. The first shuttle, Columbia, is launched. It was no coincidence that they chose the date of April 12, 1981. The Americans seem to be sending a message to us, Russians. Here is another answer to your Gagarin. We have already responded with moon landings, and now, with something just as significant, we are responding with shuttles. You don't have a reusable spacecraft, but we do. It must be said that reality soon adjusted this boasting and these parallels. This is what our next section, which I called The Late Awakening, is about. It lasted 25 years from 1986 to 2011. 1986 marked the first shuttle disaster, and 2011 was the final closure of the shuttle program. Key milestones that allowed the Americans, and us too, to see clearly. One shuttle mission to low Earth orbit cost $1.4 billion. Sometimes I will round it up to $1.5 billion. In total, 4 shuttles were built. Then one was destroyed. They built another shuttle to replace the lost one. I will talk about this. Then another one was destroyed. They didn't build a replacement shuttle. In the end, 5 shuttles were built. Out of these, 2 were lost. That's a loss of 40% of the extremely expensive spacecraft. Imagine if we lost 40 out of 100 Soyuz spacecraft. What an outcry our critics would have raised. And there were 14 fatalities. I will tell you all about this. But for now, let's focus on the economic aspect. When the program was just starting, everyone understood that the shuttles would be very expensive, but it was calculated that if they flew at least 30 times a year, they would pay for themselves. But what happened in reality? Look, this is the only launch schedule I will show. The blue bars represent the number of missions. The top is a large highlighted number 8. There's also A9. The bottom is 0. The years span from 1980 to 2011. The operational years are from 1981 to 2011. The maximum number is 9 missions per year. This was the most successful year, 1985. The following year, disaster struck. One shuttle was lost. I will tell you more about it. There was a break. For a year, the shuttles did not fly at all. Then gradually the number of missions was restored. Then another disaster occurred in 2003. Another year-long break. As a result, with these ups and downs, the shuttles flew about 4.5 times a year. You can divide all 135 flights by 30, and you'll get this figure. And what is 4.5 missions per year for 4 shuttles? Roughly speaking, one shuttle flies once a year. So, instead of reusability, we got once-a-year usability. Generally speaking, with such a number of missions, there can be no economic efficiency. Next, I will refer to the opinion of Alexander Moskalenko, the coordinator of operations for managing the Russian orbital segment of the ISS and a specialist from Space Corporation Energia. By the way, everything he says, I have cross-checked with other sources and it is consistent. He specifically pointed out that the cost of one shuttle mission was $1.4 billion. Almost $1.5 billion. It makes no sense to bring more than 3 astronauts to the ISS, as it gets cramped. 3 arrive, 3 leave. If you deliver 3 astronauts with a shuttle at a cost of $1.5 billion, then delivering one costs $500 million. Very expensive, even for super-rich America. The Soyuz system, that is, the spacecraft and the launch vehicle, is 30 times cheaper in terms of cost. Of course, the Americans were not sold tickets at cost price, but more expensively, yet it was still an order of magnitude cheaper than what the shuttles cost them. The situation with cargo is similar. The cargoes delivered by shuttles to the ISS, weighing 20 tons, were roughly the same size, slightly larger or smaller, as those delivered by our Proton rockets. Not worse at all, and an order of magnitude cheaper in price. This is Moskalenko. So, what's the conclusion? He summarizes it as follows. NASA spent 10 times more on creating the US orbital segment than Russia did on its own, which speaks of the glaring economic inefficiency of the shuttles for building and servicing space stations. Simply, the US had no other spacecraft. This is what I emphasized. The Soyuz with the Progress is ideally suited for servicing space stations. Rich America might have somehow tolerated the economic inefficiency of the shuttles, but they were dangerous to life. I want to talk about the 2 shuttle disasters. The first occurred in January 1986, when the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up. It exploded right in front of the viewers. It took off and exploded after a short while. 7 people died. In February 2003, the Columbia disaster occurred when it burned up upon re-entry into the atmosphere. We will later watch clips that explain why this happened. Another 7 people died. In general, new technology always carries an increased risk. For example, during the first missions of our Soyuz spacecraft, from 1967 to 1970, there were also 2 disasters, and 4 people died. But in the subsequent half-century, not a single cosmonaut died. I want to emphasize one more thing. Even in the most favorable times for space flights, there have been plenty of dangerous incidents both for us and for them. For instance, with our cosmonaut Alexander Serebrov, when he almost drifted off into outer space. He unhooked himself, and it was fortunate that another cosmonaut saw him and grabbed him. I felt uneasy even imagining drifting off into space, seeing the station, and feeling sad at the thought of how much longer I have to live. That's how Serebrov almost died. By the way, he was let down by a French spring hook. This raises the issue of the reliability of technology. There are plenty of such cases. I only consider those where the outcome was irreversible, a fatality. So, we have 4 fatalities, and the Americans have 14. But there have been 2 disasters here and 2 disasters for the Americans. But these are different things. It's one thing when 40% of your shuttles are lost, and another thing when 2 out of 200 spacecraft are lost. In general, it's a heavy loss. The first disaster in 1986 could still be written off as growing pains. New technology malfunctions, but what can you do? It was not anticipated. But Columbia was lost in its 22nd year of operation. This is no longer an accident, it's a chronic issue. They didn't build a replacement for Columbia. The Americans have already realized that this is the end, and they have to endure as long as possible. How did this happen? Let's just take a look to understand the depth of the failure with the shuttles. And I'm saying this without any malice. Failures happen everywhere. The main failure with the shuttles is something else. When they were retired, the moon conquerors, the Americans, had nothing left to fly on. That's the failure. Right now, the shuttles turned out to be unsuccessful, but in 30 years, at a new level, they will be revived and successful. Nevertheless, what is meant by this now? Let's look at this disaster. Here is the launch. A huge machine. By the way, this reminds me of how it would be if I arrived at my cottage not in a car, but in a large multi-passenger bus. What would my neighbors say? Probably ask what task I'm trying to solve. We see that with passengers, with people, they are not up to the task. Capcom is the flight director. Here's the explosion. It's actually good that the video is without sound because the commentary is so idiotic. Like, oh, we seem to have a problem. Everything here exploded into pieces. They seem to have a problem. Viewers are watching, and of course, we feel sorry for them. Enough. Or should we watch until the end? Its parts are flying in different directions, like fireworks, so to speak. That's the end. Now we see upset students. A teacher was included in the crew. Or was it in Columbia? In Challenger, was it?
есть мы не на второй раз пошли?
Нет, нет.
Вот сейчас точно, по-моему, на второй раз, нет? А, вот
Here are the students.
это
They are
они
still happy.
а сейчас им
Now they are being told that, unfortunately, something went wrong.
Итак,
So, the first disaster happened at launch.
катастрофа, как говорится, произошла на старте. Ну,
By the
кстати,
way,
эти огромные
these huge
бочки,
tanks are
это
solid
означает
rocket
старение.
boosters.
Это говорит о том, что
This
у
indicates
нет
that the Americans don't have powerful liquid-fueled engine.
двигатель, это
A liquid-fueled engine is more energetically efficient.
экономически выгодно. Так, а почему у меня, я хочу закрыть. И теперь уйти. А почему он не уходит?
Ну, еще раз нужно нажать.
Ага. Колумбия.
Позвольте,
Значит,
Александр Иванович,
Here Columbia is re-entering.
попробую сейчас.
да, со звуком плохо. Без звука лучше, конечно. Значит, спуск идет. Вот. И сейчас
Now it's at 20 times the speed of sound.
идет. Вот всё,
Everything is heated.
видите,
You
горит
see,
крыло.
one wing is burning.
Значит, здесь, пожалуйста, следующее. При старте
What happened was, during launch some foam fell off.
такое ощущение вспоминает
They're calling Columbia, but she's not responding. We installed doors at our cottage using foam.
такое ощущение,
It feels like they used it to attach the tanks.
этих баков. Кусок
A
такой
piece of such foam fell off during the launch and struck.
вырывает
Here's the cabin being torn off. That's it, the shuttle is lost. As they say, there's work to be done. Now they will show how a piece of foam falls off. This is computer modeling. It hit, and a hole appeared. During the mission, no one noticed this hole. There's no wind, no atmosphere out there. But during re-entry, well, what can be said? If there's a hole in an airplane's wing, it's a guaranteed crash. And here, the speed is 20 times higher. Let's end our story about the shuttle disasters. By the way, this is a shuttle opening an empty cargo bay. This is Columbia. The Columbia shuttle disaster signaled that continuing to build shuttles was no longer worth it. It's important that the accident happened in 2003. This means that by 2003, it became clear to the Americans that they needed to find a replacement for the shuttles. And they searched for it for 17 years, until 2020. And this is something we need to discuss. So, what will they fly on? Suddenly, it turned out that there was nothing to fly on. In the victorious country that carried out the moon landings, there was nothing to send astronauts into low Earth's orbit. I call NASA astronauts horseless, and I'll explain later why I use that term. The Space Shuttle would soon be retired. This would happen in 2011. The only means to reach orbit would be our Soyuz. Let's see how the Soyuz taxi worked. This is May 29, 2014. The crew arrives at the ISS. Here it's not very clear who's American and who's ours. You'll see it in the next video. March 24, 2018. Another crew arrives. But they fly there more often. I can't show everything. Here's an American floating out. Ours has already passed. Now they will all sit down looking pretty. This is our cosmonaut, the commander. Here come two American astronauts and our cosmonaut.
Наш космонавт.
This is the taxi, there.
Такси туда.
Now let's look at the taxi, back.
Возвращение.
For example, the return of Soyuz MS-06. February 2018. There will be two Americans, both in glasses. At first, I thought it was the same person, but actually, they are two different people.
Они два разных.
A burnt capsule arrived. This is a special platform used to extract the cosmonauts from the capsule, from the descent module.
Космонавтов из капсулы, из спускаемого аппарата.
Usually, employees from our space corporation MEPhI, the former Korolev firm, work here.
Бортжурнал.
The most valuable thing, the flight log, is the first to be taken out. They take out our cosmonaut. Remember the topic about the energetic persons? Here we see firsthand how cosmonauts who really flew into space return.
Кто действительно летал в космос. Сейчас
Now we'll see the first American. Here's the American astronaut, dark-haired.
темненький. Следующий
The next will be the blonde, and this one is dark-haired. And finally, the third crew member. This will be the second American astronaut. We watched 3 episodes of the Soyuz working as a space taxi for the Americans.
Союза в качестве космического такси для американцев. Если
If you allow, I will continue.
Значит,
This lasted for 9 years, from 2011 to 2020.
2020 год, и все эти годы
And all these years, the key to American access to space was literally in the hands of our space specialists.
космических специалистов. Вот
Here we see the very launch key for the Soyuz spacecraft, held by the aforementioned Alexander Moskalenko.
это Александр Москаленко. Но надо сказать, что
But it must be said that there were quite a few comrades or enthusiasts who claimed that the Americans flew on the Soyuz simply because it was cheaper for them.
под энтузиастов, которые утверждали, ну, американцы летали на Союзах просто потому,
They
что
got
так
tired of spending money on shuttles, so they decided to fly on the Soyuz.
они решили на Союзах.
And there's nothing disgraceful about that. This is a typical case of a half-truth.
Полуправде
In a half-truth, there is always some truth, and lies cling to
к
it.
нему примазывается ложь. То, что
It is completely true that the Soyuz is much cheaper.
а вот насчет
But as for it not being disgraceful, let's listen to the Americans themselves.
сейчас будут выступать
Now Americans will speak, and not just ordinary ones. The first is John Logsdon, a professor, former director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, and a member of the board that investigated the Columbia accident.
То есть человек понимает,
In other words, a person who understands the technology, otherwise he would not have become a member of the investigation board.
это стыд.
That's a failure, an embarrassment, that we have to depend on Russian taxi services.
Ненадежными и чрезмерно
A particular design for the shuttle cost too much to operate and became a burden on the program.
гнали себя в угол.
We've seen this coming for years and haven't done enough about it.
А вот здесь я не помню.
We put ourselves into this situation. Unfortunately, I did not show his words here, so I will convey them to you verbally.
Что шаттлом замены
In 2003, we said in our report the lack of a shuttle replacement,
году
that it needed to be prepared.
американцам, что
This means that already in 2003 it was clear to the Americans that the shuttles needed some kind of replacement.
We will return to this.
Michael Griffin, NASA administrator from 2005 to 2009, said, "When you push aside all the puffery and high-flying political announcements, the human spaceflight program of the US will come to an end for the indefinite future."
Perhaps this is correct.
In fact, in this case, I would intensify the question.
From this moment, there is no manned spaceflight program. What is manned spaceflight without its own spacecraft?
It's like a cavalry with riders but no horses.
And the horses have to be borrowed from the enemy. It's kind of strange.
To make sure, I looked it up on Wikipedia. It states that as of now, about 40 countries have sent their astronauts or cosmonauts into Earth's orbit. Some flew on our Soyuz, some flew on the ISS.
40 countries.
But it is considered that only 3 countries possess manned spaceflight capabilities: the USSR, Russia, the United States, and China.
What does a 9-year pause signify? Indeed, we have had pauses too. For instance, there was a 2 to 3 year gap between the Vostok and Soyuz missions. Can we say that we did not have a manned spaceflight program then?
I think not. Because if the need had arisen, we had the Vostok spacecraft and could have carried out another Vostok mission.
The Americans were in a different situation. They did not have any spacecraft for 9 years.
This means that they did not have a manned spaceflight program. Charles Bolden succeeded Michael Griffin as NASA administrator in 2009 and decided to say a few kind words about the Soyuz spacecraft. Apparently, he wanted to tell his compatriots not to be too sad about the retirement of the shuttles, as they were entrusting the fate of their astronauts to the reliable hands of the Soyuz spacecraft.
He said the following: Soyuz is the most reliable space system in the world.
It should be a matter of national pride for the Russians.
I will stop here.
Tell me, have you often heard on television, radio, or read anywhere in black and white, the fact that we, Russia, have the Soyuz and that they work so well is our national pride? Nothing of the sort.
Here, an American is teaching us how to take pride in our achievements.
Of course, he didn't do it on purpose. It just happened that way, but the situation is as it is. We don't know how to take pride in our achievements. I apologize for going off on a tangent.
Recently, my daughter presented Turkey to me as a country to look up to. She says, "Can you imagine what kind of coffee they make there?"
That's quite a coffee.
I will continue quoting Bolden. In a year, the shuttles will complete their flights. He says this in 2009. They had already decided that in 2011 they would complete the flights. I mean, there was time to roll out the Apollos.
Logsdon talks about this in 2003. Bolden talks about this in 2009, that they had already decided to retire the shuttles.
And the practical provision of the ISS will essentially remain with the Soyuz. And the last official statement.
The highest curator of NASA's space activities in the United States is the Vice President. At that time, it was Mike Pence. Here's what he says.
Remember, they said, it's simply cheaper for Americans to fly on the Soyuz. He says different words 2 years before the end of the horseless period.
Sadly, for more than 7 years, we've been forced to hitch a ride to space. And today, that cost runs about $82 million per seat.
I'm going to make you a promise. Soon, and very soon, American astronauts will return to space on American rockets launched from American soil. The position is clear.
However, his "very soon" lasted another 2 years. It was only in May 2020 that the Crew Dragon spacecraft docked with the ISS, ending the horseless period. Why do I call it the horseless period? Here's why.
Mike Pence says, "We are forced to hitch a ride to space. But this isn't hitchhiking. If you have your own car, you still take a taxi from time to time."
I arrived here by taxi. And if you find yourself alone on the road, you can hitch a ride. There's nothing disgraceful about that.
NASA's situation was different.
NASA didn't have its own car. They could only go to space on our Soyuz according to a pre-agreed schedule and pre-agreed prices. How is that hitchhiking?
In Russia, this was called horseless.
By the way, even now, those who don't have their own car are called horseless.
It was considered humiliating and one of the last stages of economic degradation.
Mike Pence is being shady here. And $82 million is not so expensive for him. The shuttles were costing them billions.
He wants to distract us from something else. I think it concerns the question, why didn't the Apollo help you out? There was enough time.
By the way, about the Crew Dragon spacecraft.
Many started congratulating. Finally, the humiliating period for the USA is over. I would hold off on the congratulations.
The experience with the shuttles suggests that. Let's wait and see. If after some time it performs at its best, thank God.
In the meantime, we remain in the horseless period and will figure out why it happened.
A familiar personality? Yevgeny Leonov. Here I remember, but here I don't.
The question is,
why did they have such a difficulty in the first place? Why do they groan about the humiliating dependence on the Russians? That there's nothing to fly on.
Roll out your Apollos. Well, maybe they ended production.
But you knew back in 2003 that you would retire the shuttles.
If we consider that the horseless period ended in 2020, they had 17 years. Where are your Apollos that conquered the moon? When discussing all issues related to the horseless period, they seem to forget about them. Here they don't remember.
But they remember to celebrate the anniversaries of the moon landings every year. By the way, with Mike Pence at the helm, because the vice president always participates in the anniversary celebrations.
Where does such group amnesia come from? Moreover, it is selective.
Here I remember, but here I don't. Since such memory lapses are difficult to track, I will give you a brief summary of the Apollo spacecraft based on NASA materials. This is what it looks like.
This is the part where the astronauts are. Although, strictly speaking, it's hard to call them astronauts. Astronauts are those who fly in space.
By the way, it's very cramped, more cramped than in our Soyuz, despite the fact that Soyuz is smaller in overall dimensions.
This is the very case they say, a little goes a long way. The Apollo spacecraft is more cramped than our Soyuz.
In the Apollos, there's 2 cubic meters per person, while in the Soyuz, there are 4 cubic meters. To give you an idea, draw a square meter here and make it 2 meters high. That will be all your space. But as NASA describes it, the spacecraft turned out wonderful. It flew to the moon.
And flying to the moon is no small feat. The launch speed is higher, the re-entry speed is higher, the fuel consumption is twice as much, and the thermal loads during re-entry are twice as high. It performed super difficult maneuvers in Earth and Moon orbits. By the way, take unsuccessful Luna 25 as an example. Orbiting the moon, making a soft landing is far from easy.
Apollo overcame all this, and apparently, 24 people went to the moon.
There were 9 missions to the moon, 6 with landings. These are NASA's lunar heroes.
It also performed well in Earth orbit.
According to NASA, there were 6 missions to low Earth orbit with 18 astronauts.
It performed well, went through hell and high water.
A brilliant spacecraft.
Note that it surpassed both the Crew Dragon and the modern Soyuz for the simple reason that these spacecraft currently only go to low Earth orbit, while it went all the way to the moon.
And with such a brilliant spacecraft, higher expectations are warranted. I ask you to be a little more patient, we are approaching the conclusions. Now we are talking only about the Apollo. This is an auxiliary picture.
This is a photo of our Mir space station, which was very actively and successfully operating before we traded it for the International Space Station.
Here, I wanted to show only one thing.
From the surface of the Earth to the Moon is 400,000 kilometers, but to launch from the surface of the Earth and get to the ISS, you need to cover only 400 kilometers. These are tasks of completely different scales.
We must ask the question, why didn't they overcome it? Why didn't they restore Apollo production? Why did they switch to our Soyuz? The conclusion probably already suggests itself, but I want to briefly remind you of the discussion of past topics because then the conclusion will sound more justified. Moreover, any conclusion is not very reliable if it is based on a single fact.
So, we got acquainted with the topic, the color of the moon, and saw that the astronauts were planting their colorful flags into a gray surface, whereas the moon is brown. But if so, then this gray surface is not on the moon, and they did not arrive there on the Apollo spacecraft.
Most likely, they arrived in their personal cars, as we are talking about a studio. The well-known topic, energetic ones.
This is the last Apollo.
Look at how the astronaut jumps out of Apollo. Even the image of his foot is blurred. And this is how they climb out the Axiom 2 spacecraft 48 years later. We've all seen this.
First of all, the astronauts didn't walk out of the Axiom 2 Crew Dragon. They were taken out and put on their feet. There he is, knees are buckling.
I'm not gloating, that's just how it is.
After zero gravity, a person is weakened. Onto a mobile stretcher and straight to the sick ward. They are not jumping out of a spacecraft, but out of some kind of mock-up.
Yes, it's slightly charred to make it look real.
But people don't jump out of spacecraft full of energy.
You've seen this, there's a lot of such footage nowadays. Finally, let's address what we've just seen.
How can we reconcile NASA's brilliance in 1969 to 72, when Apollos easily went as far as 400,000 kilometers from Earth, with the space helplessness from 2011 to 2020?
I hope you at least partially agree with my conclusion.
It's quite simple.
All these questions disappear if we just admit to ourselves that a functioning Apollo spacecraft never existed. Here are the conclusions.
This is such a responsible matter that I will read them out. Then everything aligns. Indeed, during the anniversary celebrations of the mythical landings, Americans glorify the mythical Apollo.
It's all logical. But when the shuttles were decommissioned and astronauts needed to be ferried, what to use to get them to orbit?
A mythical spacecraft won't help, a real one is needed.
No mention of Apollo. Why didn't they bring the Apollo spacecraft back to the launch pads? But how can you bring back something that never existed? And how to resume production of a functioning spacecraft when Apollo never functioned? And the long development time, at least 9 years.
Shuttles were decommissioned in 2011. The horseless period ended in 2020, and Crew Dragon appeared.
You can say many things about Americans, but not that they are foolish.
If the Columbia disaster happened in 2003 and they didn't start building new shuttles, then they must have already been thinking about what their astronauts would fly on. Myths and mythical spacecraft don't create engineering schools.
I'll illustrate my point with one simple example. We'll watch a clip about the American missions, about the Apollo launches.
The clip's author, a participant in the Apollo program, was awarded for good work, for developing carts for astronauts, equipment transporters.
Later they had rovers, but initially, they supposedly dragged carts with instruments across the lunar surface. For developing a special cart, they were sent to watch the launch of Apollo 11.
They are sure that their cart worked well on the moon. If I made such or any other equipment, and they tell me that my equipment performed well on the moon, I would be confident that I was on the right track. And when the shuttles are gone and I need to save America's honor, I will have to restore the Apollo spacecraft. I will rebuild them in the same way that was said to have performed excellently.
Myths lead to the degradation of scientific and engineering schools.
That's what I want to say. There was no experience, no groundwork, but rather a degradation of these schools.
Hence the 17 years of development.
Well, one last thing, I'll just mention this. Are there any other technical issues?
There are many technical issues. But this is for discussion at thematic conferences. If there ever is a commission to investigate the worldwide space hoax called Apollo, those technical issues can be discussed there. Our colleagues have found many such issues.
Does your argument include the increased radiation outside Earth's magnetosphere?
No.
Although this is a very important and very interesting factor. Why not? By the way, when I studied, until the 3rd year, my specialty was nuclear physics. My diploma states, theoretical nuclear physics.
Thank you very much, dear host.
The thing is, discussing this issue requires a deep, or at least good, understanding of something as basic as the units of radiation measurement.
We have a prejudice that if an atomic bomb exploded somewhere, there will never be life there again.
Excuse me, but where are the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki located?
And so on. Here, special knowledge of the issue is needed.
That's the first point. Second, I personally have the opinion, I won't say conviction, that these data are actually classified.
For a simple reason. I suppose that if these data were declassified, it would be a blow to the American missions. And we have many people interested in good relations with the Americans. We will probably touch on the topic of tracking the Apollo missions. I also have something interesting on this topic. I contacted one institute. This is not classified. There is a huge institute in Moscow at the Avia Modernaya subway station.
It changed names so often that I will only name one of the first. In Soviet times, it was called NI 885, and immediately after it was called the Electronics Research Institute.
Their task was to track the Apollo missions.
I acted very modestly.
A modest doctor of physical and mathematical sciences asks to tell about the results of tracking the Apollo missions. I wanted to look at the tracking results.
The reaction was very painful. The deputy director of the institute told me, I will not answer you and will forbid my employees to talk to you.
My student worked there. He is now a very respected person and has surpassed me. I am very glad about this. He says that even the next day, your call was still being discussed.
The deputy director himself said, we receive a lot from the Americans. Why should we quarrel with them? So, the issue of the background radiation.
There is no official data.
In general, the purpose of my conversations with you, I hope they are interesting to you, is not to tell you everything about this, but to spark interest. There is much to delve into here.
If someone feels strong in radiation physics, they can examine this issue themselves.
I can say one thing. This is a serious issue. But a serious question requires a serious answer.
I don't have such figures.